In the early 1600s, as European empires expanded across the oceans, a new battle for power was unfolding on the western coast of Africa. Warships carrying the flag of the Portuguese Empire arrived along the shores of Central Africa. Their mission was simple: control the land, control the trade, and control the people. Kingdoms that had stood for generations suddenly found themselves facing a new and ruthless enemy. Among those kingdoms was the powerful African state of Ndongo, located in what we now know as Angola. For years, its rulers struggled to resist the growing influence of the Portuguese Empire. Villages were raided, wars were fought, and thousands of people were captured and forced into slavery. Many leaders tried to negotiate with the Europeans. Others tried to fight them. Most failed. But history would soon remember one ruler who refused to surrender. A leader whose intelligence, strategy, and courage would challenge an empire. Her name was Nzinga. Born into the royal family of the Kingdom of Ndongo, Nzinga was not raised to be an ordinary princess. She learned politics, she studied diplomacy, and she understood something that many rulers of her time did not. To defeat a powerful enemy, you must first learn how they think. In 1622, Nzinga traveled to meet the Portuguese governor for peace negotiations. The meeting was meant to be a display of power. The Portuguese governor sat comfortably on a chair, while Nzinga was offered nothing but a floor mat. It was a clear message. They wanted her to feel small. They wanted her to understand who held the power. But Nzinga refused to accept humiliation. Instead, she calmly ordered one of her servants to kneel beside her, and she sat on the servant's back, using them as her throne. In that moment, Nzinga sent a message that the Portuguese would never forget. She would not bow, she would not surrender, and she would not allow her kingdom to be treated as inferior. What followed would become one of the most extraordinary stories of resistance in African history. For decades, Nzinga fought wars, forged alliances, and outmaneuvered the most powerful colonial empire of her time. Empires believed they could conquer Africa, but they had never faced a queen like Nzinga. Long before the rise of Queen Nzinga, Central Africa was a land of powerful kingdoms and thriving cultures. Across vast forests and rivers, communities built cities, farms, and trade networks that connected distant regions of the continent. One of the most important of these kingdoms was the Kingdom of Ndongo. Located in what we now call Angola, Ndongo was ruled by a powerful monarch known as the Angola. The title Angola symbolized authority, leadership, and control over the surrounding lands. The kingdom was strong, its people were skilled farmers and warriors, and its leaders controlled important trade routes across Central Africa. But in the late 1400s, the world beyond Africa began to change. European explorers were searching for new trade routes, new wealth, and new territories to control. Among them were the sailors of the Portuguese Empire. In 1482, Portuguese ships arrived on the western coast of Central Africa for the first time. At first, they came as traders. They exchanged cloth, metal tools, and weapons for ivory, copper, and other valuable goods. African rulers believed these newcomers were simply another group of foreign merchants, but the ambitions of the Portuguese Empire were much greater than trade. Over time, their interests shifted towards something far more profitable: the Atlantic slave trade. European colonies in the Americas demanded a massive supply of enslaved labor, and Central Africa became one of the main targets for this brutal system. Portuguese traders began forming alliances with certain local rulers. Weapons and military support were offered in exchange for captives.
Wars between neighboring kingdoms grew more frequent. Entire villages were attacked. Families were torn apart. Thousands of people were captured and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean. As Portuguese influence grew along the coast, pressure began to build on the inland African kingdoms. Among the most affected was the Kingdom of Ndongo. Portuguese governors wanted control over the region. They wanted access to its people, its land, and its power. Conflicts between Ndongo and the Portuguese began to escalate. Battles were fought, territories changed hands, and the balance of power in the region began to shift. Ndongo's rulers found themselves facing a new type of enemy, an empire with advanced weapons, powerful ships, and an expanding global network. For many African kingdoms, resisting such a force seemed almost impossible. But history often changes when the right leader appears at the right moment. And in the royal court of Ndongo, a young woman was growing up, a princess who was watching these events carefully, learning about politics, studying diplomacy, and preparing for a future that no one could yet imagine. Her name was Nzinga.
Before she became a legend, before European governors feared her name, before she stood against one of the most powerful empires of her time, Nzinga was a daughter of Central Africa. She was born into the royal family of Ndongo, a kingdom already under growing pressure from outside forces. This was not a world of peace. It was a world of strategy, of alliances, of betrayal, of rulers who understood that power could vanish overnight. Nzinga grew up inside that world. She was not raised in ignorance of politics. She watched court debates. She listened to the concerns of nobles. She observed how decisions were made, and how even small choices could shape the future of a kingdom. Her father, the ruler of Ndongo, understood the dangers surrounding them. The Portuguese were becoming stronger along the coast. Local rivalries were growing more intense, and the kingdom needed leaders who could think as well as fight. Nzinga proved early that she was different. She was intelligent, sharp, observant. She learned how power worked. She understood that a ruler could not survive on strength alone. A ruler needed patience, timing, and the ability to read both friends and enemies. Some traditions describe Nzinga as fearless from a young age. Others emphasize her gift for diplomacy and speech. Most likely, she was both, because the woman history remembers was never defined by a single quality. She could negotiate when necessary, and when negotiation failed, she could fight. This combination would one day make her one of the most formidable leaders in African history. As a princess of Ndongo, Nzinga did not simply live a sheltered royal life. She grew up in a kingdom facing crisis. Portuguese expansion was no longer a distant concern. It was an immediate threat. Slave raids were increasing, political pressure was growing, and every ruler in the region had to make difficult choices: resist, cooperate, or be destroyed. Nzinga watched all of this unfold, and she learned. She learned that foreign empires rarely came as equals. They came with smiles and demands, with trade and weapons, with promises and ambition. By the time she reached adulthood, Nzinga was no ordinary royal figure. She had become one of the most capable minds in the Ndongo court. She was trusted for her intelligence, respected for her presence, and recognized for something even more important: her ability to remain calm under pressure. That ability would soon be tested. After the death of her father, power within Ndongo became unstable. Her brother took the throne, but his rule came during one of the most dangerous periods in the kingdom's history. The Portuguese were pressing harder. Internal tensions were rising, and Ndongo needed leadership that could survive both foreign aggression and domestic uncertainty.
Nzinga became more deeply involved in politics. She advised, she observed, she prepared. And when diplomacy became necessary, she was the one chosen to represent the kingdom. That decision alone says a great deal. In a moment of crisis, when the fate of Ndongo depended on negotiation with the Portuguese, it was Nzinga who was sent. Not because she was convenient, but because she was capable. In 1622, she met the Portuguese governor in Luanda. It would become one of the most famous diplomatic encounters in African history. The Portuguese tried to stage the meeting as a display of superiority. The governor was seated on a chair. Nzinga was offered no chair at all, only a mat on the floor. It was a calculated insult, a message without words. They wanted her to sit below him, to appear lesser, to accept humiliation in front of both courts. But Nzinga understood symbolism. She knew power was not only exercised through armies, it was exercised through posture, through image, through the silent message of who stands above whom. So she refused the role they had prepared for her. According to the famous account, she ordered one of her attendants to kneel beside her. Then she sat upon the attendant's back, raising herself to the same level as the governor. In one moment, the insult was reversed. Nzinga had answered humiliation with control. She had shown the Portuguese that Ndongo's representatives would not bow. That scene endured for a reason, because it revealed exactly who she was. She was proud but not reckless, bold but calculated. She understood theater, she understood politics, and above all, she understood how empires tried to dominate others. They did not conquer only with force, they conquered through ritual, through hierarchy, through the expectation that others would accept inferiority. Nzinga rejected that completely. The negotiations themselves brought temporary agreements, but peace was fragile. The Portuguese still wanted control, Ndongo still fought for survival, and the crisis surrounding the kingdom only deepened. But after that meeting, one thing was clear. Nzinga was no longer simply a princess in the royal court. She had become a political force, a woman capable of facing empire without fear. The years that followed would test her more than ever before. War would spread, rulers would fall, alliances would break, and Nzinga herself would be forced into one of the most difficult transformations imaginable, from royal diplomat to wartime ruler. But even before she claimed full power, the qualities that defined her were already there. Discipline, intelligence, pride, patience, and the refusal to be made small. This was the woman the Portuguese would underestimate, and that mistake would cost them dearly.
For a short time, diplomacy delayed the storm. The negotiations between Nzinga and the Portuguese governor created a fragile peace. Agreements were signed, promises were made, but beneath the surface, the conflict was far from over. The Portuguese Empire had not crossed the Atlantic simply to trade. Their ambitions were much greater. They wanted control over Central Africa, control over its land, control over its people, and above all, control over the growing Atlantic slave trade. The Kingdom of Ndongo stood directly in the path of those ambitions. As long as Ndongo remained independent, Portuguese authority in the region would always be limited. And so, the fragile peace slowly began to collapse. Portuguese forces continued expanding inland. Allied groups were encouraged to raid Ndongo territory. Villages were attacked.
Communities were destroyed, and thousands of people were captured and sent toward the coast. For the rulers of Ndongo, the message was becoming painfully clear. This was no longer diplomacy, it was conquest. During this time, political turmoil inside Ndongo only made the situation worse. Nzinga's brother ruled as king, but his leadership faced enormous pressure. War with the Portuguese was intensifying. Internal divisions weakened the kingdom, and fear spread among the population. Eventually, the crisis reached a breaking point. After the death of her brother, Nzinga claimed the throne. Her rise to power was controversial. Some nobles questioned whether a woman should rule during such a dangerous time. But Nzinga understood something many others did not. The survival of the kingdom depended not on tradition, but on leadership, and leadership was exactly what she intended to provide. As ruler of Ndongo, Nzinga faced an enemy that was powerful, organized, and determined to dominate the region. The Portuguese possessed firearms, they had access to European military resources, and they maintained a network of alliances with rival African groups. But Nzinga refused to accept defeat. Instead, she adapted. She reorganized her forces, she strengthened alliances with neighboring communities, and she began transforming resistance into a long-term strategy. Nzinga knew she could not defeat the Portuguese in a single battle. The empire had too many resources, too many soldiers, too many advantages. So instead of one decisive confrontation, Nzinga turned the war into something far more difficult for the Portuguese to control. A war of endurance, a war of strategy, a war where territory, alliances, and timing mattered as much as raw military strength. Her armies moved through forests and rivers, striking quickly before disappearing again. Supply routes were disrupted, Portuguese outposts were threatened, and the conflict spread across the region. But the struggle was brutal. Portuguese forces continued launching attacks into Ndongo territory. Entire settlements were burned. Thousands of people were displaced. The war was not only a battle for land.
It was a battle for survival. For many African rulers, such pressure would have eventually forced surrender. But Nzinga refused to accept that outcome. When Ndongo itself became increasingly difficult to defend, Nzinga made a bold decision. Instead of surrendering, she relocated her power base. She moved east and eventually established authority in another African kingdom, Matamba. From there, Nzinga rebuilt her strength. Matamba became the new center of resistance against Portuguese expansion. Under Nzinga's leadership, the kingdom transformed into a powerful military state. Warriors were organized, defenses were strengthened, diplomatic alliances were expanded. Nzinga even opened negotiations with other European powers who were rivals of Portugal. Every decision she made served the same goal: preserve independence, protect her people, and resist colonial domination. The Portuguese had expected a quick victory when they first began interfering in the region. Instead, they found themselves locked in decades of conflict with one of the most determined leaders they had ever encountered. Nzinga proved again and again that resistance did not require overwhelming strength. It required intelligence, patience, and the willingness to adapt. The war between Nzinga and the Portuguese would continue for many years, sometimes through open battles, sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through careful political maneuvering. But one thing had become undeniable. The Portuguese Empire had not encountered a ruler they could easily defeat. They had encountered Nzinga, a queen who refused to surrender her land, her authority, or her future. By the time Nzinga established her power in Matamba, she was no longer simply a ruler trying to protect her kingdom. She had become something much larger, a symbol of resistance, a leader who refused to allow foreign empires to dictate the future of Central Africa. Matamba quickly transformed under her rule. What had once been a regional kingdom now became the center of a powerful resistance movement. Warriors gathered from different communities. Refugees fleeing Portuguese raids found protection within Nzinga's territory. Entire populations displaced by war began rebuilding their lives under her authority. Nzinga understood that survival required more than courage. It required organization. So she began strengthening the foundations of her new kingdom. Military training became more disciplined. Warriors were organized into structured forces. Defensive strategies were developed to protect key regions. But Nzinga's greatest strength was never just military power, it was strategy. She knew that defeating the Portuguese would require more than fighting alone, so she began building alliances. Neighboring African leaders who also feared Portuguese expansion were encouraged to cooperate. Trade networks were strengthened, diplomatic relations expanded. Nzinga even opened communication with European rivals of Portugal. The world of the 17th century was deeply interconnected. Empires competed against each other across oceans, and Nzinga understood how to use those rivalries to her advantage. By carefully navigating these alliances, she prevented the Portuguese from isolating her kingdom. Instead of facing one enemy alone, Nzinga created a network of political and military support. For the Portuguese, this made the war far more difficult. What they had once expected to be a quick campaign had become a long and exhausting struggle. Year after year, their forces encountered resistance. Supply routes were disrupted, outposts were threatened, and the authority they hoped to establish over the region remained incomplete. Nzinga's leadership was also deeply symbolic. She appeared publicly as both ruler and warrior, clothed in royal authority yet fully prepared for war. Her presence alone inspired confidence among her followers. Stories of her courage spread across Central Africa. Some accounts described her personally inspecting armies before battle. Others spoke of her ability to negotiate with diplomats in the morning and plan military campaigns by night. Whether these stories were exaggerated or not, the message was clear. Nzinga was not a passive monarch, she was an active commander. Under her rule, Matamba became one of the most powerful political forces in the region. Its stability attracted traders, its armies discouraged invasion, and its ruler gained a reputation that extended far beyond Central Africa. The Portuguese governors who once believed they could easily dominate the region now faced a far more complicated reality. Nzinga had not simply survived their expansion, she had adapted to it. She had reorganized her power, and she had created a kingdom capable of resisting one of the most powerful colonial empires of the time. But Nzinga's struggle was never only about war. It was also about survival in a rapidly changing world. European empires were expanding across continents. Trade networks were shifting, and the political balance of Africa itself was evolving. Nzinga navigated these changes with remarkable intelligence. At times, she fought fiercely. At other times, she negotiated carefully. She understood when confrontation was necessary and when diplomacy could achieve the same result. This balance between force and strategy allowed her kingdom to endure. Decades passed. Wars continued, but Nzinga remained in power. Few rulers in history have faced such prolonged pressure from foreign empires and still maintained their authority. Yet Nzinga did exactly that. Her leadership transformed Matamba into something far greater than a refuge from war. It became a symbol that resistance was possible, a symbol that African kingdoms could adapt to the changing world without surrendering their independence.
And as the years went on, the legend of Nzinga continued to grow. She was no longer just a queen defending her land. She had become one of the most formidable leaders of her era, a warrior, a strategist, and a ruler whose determination forced an empire to reconsider its ambitions.
By the later years of her life, Queen Nzinga had already lived through decades of war. She had faced betrayal, she had seen kingdoms fall, and she had fought one of the most powerful empires of her time. Yet, against all odds, she was still ruling. From her capital in the Kingdom of Matamba, Nzinga governed a kingdom that had survived one of the most turbulent eras in Central African history. For many rulers, a life of constant war would eventually bring exhaustion, but Nzinga remained deeply involved in the affairs of her kingdom. She continued to guide political decisions, she oversaw diplomatic negotiations, and she ensured that Matamba remained strong and independent. By this time, Nzinga was no longer simply a wartime leader. She had become a seasoned stateswoman. Years of experience had sharpened her understanding of politics and diplomacy. Rather than endless conflict, Nzinga increasingly focused on stability. Trade networks were restored. Communities that had been destroyed during earlier wars slowly began to rebuild. Refugees who had once fled violence found new homes under her protection. Her kingdom became a place where displaced populations could recover and rebuild their lives. At the same time, relations with the Portuguese began to change. Decades of warfare had shown both sides the limits of endless conflict. Portuguese governors realized that Nzinga was not an enemy who could easily be removed, and Nzinga understood that peace could offer her people a future that constant war could not. Gradually, diplomatic relations improved. Negotiations created new agreements between Matamba and Portuguese authorities along the coast. Trade once again began flowing through the region. And although tensions never completely disappeared, a fragile balance of power began to emerge. Nzinga had accomplished something extraordinary. She had fought the Portuguese when resistance was necessary, and she had negotiated when diplomacy served her kingdom better. Few leaders in history managed to balance these two paths successfully, but Nzinga did. Her later years were marked by careful governance and political stability. She strengthened the institutions of her kingdom. She ensured that her successors would inherit a functioning and organized state, and she continued to command the respect of both allies and former enemies. Travelers who visited the region often heard stories about the remarkable queen who had ruled for so long. Stories of her intelligence, stories of her courage, stories of the ruler who had once faced Portuguese governors without fear. By the early 1660s, Nzinga was already considered one of the most powerful figures in Central Africa. Few leaders of her era had governed for so many years, and even fewer had survived the immense pressures of colonial expansion. In 1663, after decades of leadership, Queen Nzinga's long life finally came to an end. She was believed to be more than 80 years old. Her death marked the end of one of the most extraordinary political careers in African history. But the kingdom she had built did not disappear. The institutions she created continued to guide Matamba long after her passing. Her successors inherited a kingdom that had survived war, foreign invasion, and decades of instability. And that alone was a testament to Nzinga's leadership. She had not only fought for her kingdom, she had preserved it. And even after her death, the legend of Queen Nzinga continued to spread. Across Central Africa, people remembered the queen who refused to bow to empire, a ruler who had faced one of the most powerful colonial forces of the 17th century and endured. Her story would travel far beyond her own lifetime, becoming one of the most powerful symbols of resistance in African history. After decades of war, diplomacy, and resistance, Queen Nzinga had achieved something remarkable. She had survived. For years, the Portuguese Empire had attempted to dominate the kingdoms of Central Africa. They had sent soldiers, they had built alliances, they had tried diplomacy, intimidation, and conquest.
Yet Nzinga remained in power. By the middle of the 17th century, the long struggle between Nzinga and the Portuguese began to change. Both sides had fought for many years. Both sides had suffered losses. And slowly, the possibility of peace began to emerge. Nzinga, now an experienced and seasoned ruler, understood that survival sometimes required a different kind of victory. Not every battle had to be fought on the battlefield. Sometimes the greatest victory was stability. Negotiations between Nzinga and Portuguese officials gradually opened the door for a new political arrangement. Trade resumed, diplomatic relations improved, and although tensions never fully disappeared, a more stable balance of power began to take shape. Nzinga continued to rule her kingdom from Matamba with remarkable authority. Her government restored order in regions that had once been devastated by war. Communities rebuilt their homes, trade routes reopened, and her kingdom once again became a center of political and economic life in the region. What made Nzinga's reign so extraordinary was not simply that she resisted an empire. It was that she managed to rule for decades during one of the most turbulent periods in Central African history. Many rulers were overthrown, many kingdoms disappeared, but Nzinga endured. By the time she reached the later years of her life, she had become more than a monarch. She had become a legend. Travelers and diplomats carried stories of her leadership across continents. Her reputation spread far beyond the borders of her kingdom. Some described her as a fierce warrior. Others praised her intelligence and diplomatic skill. But nearly all accounts agreed on one thing: Nzinga was a ruler unlike any other. She had navigated a world shaped by colonial expansion, shifting alliances, and brutal conflict. And yet she preserved the independence and authority of her kingdom. When Queen Nzinga died in 1663, she left behind a political legacy that few leaders could match. She had ruled for decades, she had fought powerful enemies, and she had shaped the destiny of Central Africa during a time of enormous change. Her successors continued to govern the Kingdom of Matamba for many years after her death, but Nzinga's influence did not disappear with her passing. Her story became part of African historical memory. Generations remembered the queen who refused to bow to empire. Today, historians around the world recognize Nzinga as one of the most remarkable leaders in African history. Her life represents more than just resistance. It represents strategy, leadership, and the determination to defend sovereignty in the face of overwhelming pressure. Empires rise, empires fall, but the legacy of Queen Nzinga continues to endure. A queen who refused humiliation, a ruler who challenged an empire, and a leader whose story still echoes through the history of Africa.